The boy from a sun-scorched farm stepped into the most prestigious school in America. No one knew that inside those cracked boots walked a mind capable of changing the entire field of mathematics. Clayton Reed walked as if silence itself had raised him. The marble corridors of Phillips Exit Academy carried echoes of polished shoes, clipped laughter, and the sharp voices of boys already rehearsing futures of power. But Clayton's steps were uneven, softened by boots that had long since lost their shape. His blazer sagged at the shoulders, its fabric slightly frayed. In his hand was a notebook bound not by leather or machine stitching, but by the coarse thread of his mother's needle. To those who passed him, he looked out of place, even fragile. Yet within him burned a patience as old as the land he came from. He paused beneath a bronze bust that towered in the main hall. It was the likeness of Professor Thomas Whitmore, chalk raised high, eyes narrowed with the permanent suspicion of a man who believed every answer must be defended. To most students, the statue was intimidating. To Clayton, it was simply a challenge, like the cracked soil of his hometown that demanded one more calculation before it would yield water. He stared at it, then whispered to himself so softly no one else could hear. Not here to impress, just here to understand. In Amarillo, Texas, there were no marble halls, no oil portraits, no libraries filled with rows of books. There was only dust, endless sky, and a silence that pressed itself into the bones of anyone who stayed. Rain came rarely, and when it did, the children of the town watched it like a miracle. Clayton's father had died before he turned 10, a man worn thin by years of bending to cotton plants and breathing in the invisible grit of pesticides. His mother, Eleanor, carried the household alone. She scrubbed hospital floors at night, her hands red and raw, but she never let her son see her despair. Instead, she gave him scraps of paper. Old hospital invoices, misprinted flyers, the backs of food receipts. "For your numbers," she told him, stacking them in a box. To anyone else they were trash, but to Clayton they were a field, waiting to be planted. He would sit at the kitchen table and cover them with equations, sometimes neatly, sometimes in furious bursts that slanted off the page. When the box emptied, he returned to writing on cardboard, brown paper bags, even the inside of old cereal boxes. At 10 years old, he built his first instrument of measurement, a rain gauge pieced together from a soda can, a ruler, and bits of chicken wire. He buried it behind the house and checked it daily. Sometimes it was dry for weeks, and in that emptiness he learned that silence itself could be data. Sometimes the wind blew the water sideways, and he recorded not only the measurement, but the distortion, discovering the concept of error margins without ever hearing the term. The first time the gauge clogged with dust, he began to adjust, correcting by estimation. His mother once came outside and asked him why he stared so long at a can that caught nothing. He answered with all the certainty his young voice could carry, "Because even nothing has a pattern." Numbers became his companions, not as lifeless symbols, but as voices. A slope was the angle of a roof swaying before it collapsed in the wind. A parabola was the arc of a bucket swinging water from the well. A derivative was the quickening of a creek when the rain doubled. He never memorized formulas to please a teacher. He watched them, as if each number remembered a story of the world and whispered it only to him. By the time he reached 16, he had filled 3 thick notebooks with such whispers. His mother, with needle and cloth, stitched together a 4th, sturdier than the rest. On its inside cover, in his own heavy pencil, Clayton wrote a single sentence that became a vow. Every number remembers something. You just have to listen long enough. That notebook lay in his hand now as he walked the foreign grounds of Phillips Exit Academy. His dorm room was too clean, too quiet in the wrong way. The sheets glared white. The desk lamp worked with a single click. On the table lay a fountain pen, gifted by the school, untouched. Clayton placed only one thing on the desk: his notebook. It was enough. The next morning, he sat in the back row of a room where the air smelled of chalk and expectation. The course title was Mathematical Modeling in Nonlinear Systems. The instructor, Thomas Whitmore himself. Whitmore entered with the gravity of stone carved long ago. His hair was white, his suit severe, his reputation infamous. He was known not only for brilliance but for a habit of humiliation. Students whispered that he could crush a mind with a single correction. He picked up the chalk without greeting, and in quick, harsh strokes, filled the board with a system of 3 equations. "Solve this," he said flatly. "Given the boundary conditions." The room hushed into frantic scribbles. Students bent over notebooks. Pens raced. Calculators flickered. Clayton did not move at first. He read the board the way he once read dry earth, waiting for the smallest sign of truth. His pencil hovered, then stopped. Something was wrong. The 3rd equation bent the wrong way. The boundary condition was nonlinear, hyperbolic, like a rope sagging under its own weight. At the origin, the system contradicted itself. He checked again and again. It did not resolve. He raised his hand. His voice was low, careful. "Sir, if the boundary behaves hyperbolically near the origin, the system collapses. The 3rd term isn't continuous." Laughter rippled at the front. "Farmboy," someone whispered. But Whitmore paused. He turned back to the board, eyes narrowing. Slowly, he wiped away a line, rewrote a symbol. Silence pressed against the walls. Then he said, without smile or scorn, "Good catch." Clayton nodded once, opened his notebook, wrote in the margin, "Even ivory towers crack." But numbers, they wait. For someone patient enough to see. When class ended, no one spoke to him, but no one laughed anymore. Whitmore passed him in the hallway later, his stride a fraction slower than before, as though something in his certainty had shifted. Outside, the lawns were manicured, the trees already tipped with gold. Yet the wind smelled faintly of Amarillo, dust carried across distance. Clayton sat under a maple tree alone, not from loneliness, but because solitude was the ground in which his mind grew best. He thought of his mother reading to him at night from a battered nursing manual, making the words sound like science. "The area of a trapezoid," she once told him, smiling over folded sheets, "is the big side plus the small side, times the height, divided by 2. It's like hugging everything, big or small, and giving it room to grow." That night, in the stillness of his dorm, Clayton opened his notebook to the first page. Beneath his mother's words, he wrote one more line. "They all move fast here, but the earth moves slow. And numbers, they wait. I will too." The second morning of classes broke with a sky that seemed too clean, as if the rain had been polished away. Clayton Reed walked slowly through the courtyard, notebook tucked against his side. He had not spoken to anyone since the day before. He had not needed to. The page he had written the night before was enough. The earth moves slow. Numbers wait. I will too. When he entered the classroom, the air was already heavy with anticipation. Students leaned forward, their pens ready. Professor Whitmore stood at the board, chalk poised like a blade. Without greeting, he wrote a new system, more complex this time. 3 equations expanded into 4, boundaries stretched across the board like fences closing in on every side. "This," Whitmore said, his voice dry as gravel, "is what separates those who follow instructions from those who think. He turned, eyes scanning the room. Find the solution. The students bent immediately, papers filling with symbols. Clayton watched. He copied the equations into his notebook, then paused. His pencil stopped halfway through the third line. Something stirred in him. A faint echo of the rain gauge, the way water never quite behaved as the rules said it should. He worked through the numbers carefully. Within minutes, the room was alive with frustration. Pages tore. Calculators beeped. One boy cursed under his breath. Sarah Chun, who sat 2 rows ahead, chewed her pencil eraser down to the metal. Clayton looked again. At first glance, the system looked solvable, but as he pushed the symbols forward, a contradiction unfolded. The boundaries fought the equations, refusing to line up. He turned the page, tried again. Same result. A cold thought slid into him. This problem wasn't made to be solved. It was a trap. He raised his head. Whitmore was leaning on the desk, watching. His lips pressed into the faintest of smiles. Clayton looked down again. If it was a trap, then the mistake was not in the arithmetic, but in the structure itself. He thought of water spilling from one level to another, carrying its pressure downward. He thought of terraces cut into the Texas hills, one field feeding the next. He thought of cascades. He began to draw lines on the page, dividing the system into layers. Each equation fed into the next like water falling from stone to stone. At the final boundary, the contradiction remained, stark and undeniable. But when he traced it back up, the false note revealed itself. The boundary was incompatible from the start. It was not a puzzle to be solved, but a mirror meant to show who was looking. Clayton closed his notebook. He lifted his hand. "Sir," he said, voice even, "this problem has no solution. The boundary conditions contradict the system." The room froze. Sarah stopped chewing her pencil. Wesley, the boy who had muttered "Farmboy" the day before, lowered his pen. Whitmore did not move. His eyes narrowed, flicking from the board to Clayton's notebook. "Explain," he said. Clayton stood. His knees trembled slightly, but his voice did not. "It helps to imagine the system as a cascade. Each equation pours into the next. If one layer is unstable, it destabilizes everything beneath it. Here, the third condition contradicts the lower boundary. The contradiction cannot be removed. It only reveals itself once you trace the flow back to the source." He walked to the board, chalk dust floating around him. With slow strokes, he drew a set of boxes, each feeding into the next, arrows marking the flow. He circled the final contradiction, then followed it upward, arrow by arrow, until it landed on the faulty boundary. "Here," he said softly, "the cascade collapses because the source is false." The room was silent. The board seemed to echo. Sarah stared at him as if seeing a new species. Wesley, who had smirked the day before, leaned forward, his expression unreadable. Whitmore's hand tightened on his piece of chalk. For a long time he said nothing. Then, with a sharp crack, he broke the chalk in half against the board. "Sit," he said. Clayton returned to his seat. He opened his notebook, wrote one sentence. "Numbers are not cages. They are rivers. Follow them long enough, and they reveal where they truly began." Whitmore turned to the class. His voice was low. "The method you just saw. I have not seen it before. We will call it a cascade approach." He let the words hang, then continued. "For those of you still struggling, you may study this, or you may forget it. The choice is yours." but no one moved. The silence remained, not of confusion, but of respect too new to name. When the bell rang, students filed out slowly, their eyes flicking back to Clayton as if afraid to look too long. Sarah paused by his desk, opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. She left without a word. Clayton stayed seated, his hand resting on the notebook. For him, the moment was not triumph. It was simply clarity. He remembered his father's voice once, weary from work in the fields. "The earth does not lie, son. You just have to listen long enough." He closed the notebook. That was enough. That evening, Whitmore called him aside. The professor's office smelled of old books and chalk dust. The desk was cluttered with drafts, equations scribbled in margins, half-finished manuscripts. Whitmore leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowed. "Read," he said. "Where did you learn that?" Clayton hesitated. "From the land, sir." Whitmore raised an eyebrow. "The land?" "Yes," Clayton answered. "Rain falls in steps. Streams feed streams. If one level breaks, the water changes everything below it. Equations behave the same." Whitmore stared at him for a long time. Then he reached for the notebook in Clayton's hand. "May I?" Clayton hesitated only a moment before passing it forward. Whitmore opened it. His eyes moved slowly across the dense pages, filled with penciled equations, diagrams, crossed-out proofs, words like rethink and try again scrawled in the margins. Some pages were smudged with dirt, others patched with tape. It was not the work of a trained student, but of someone who had wrestled with numbers in solitude until they surrendered. Whitmore closed the notebook gently, more gently than Clayton expected. "Your method was correct, and your language, cascade, is fitting." He leaned forward, his voice sharp again. "But know this. Mathematics does not forgive pride. If you seek attention, it will devour you." Clayton met his gaze, calm, steady. "I don't want attention," he said. "I just want to hear what the numbers are saying." For the first time, Whitmore's face softened, if only for a breath. Then he waved his hand. "Go. I'll see you tomorrow." Clayton left the office and stepped into the evening air. The courtyard was lit by lanterns, the sky deep with autumn stars. He stopped beneath the bronze bust of Whitmore again, the professor's stone eyes as sharp as ever. Clayton touched the base of the statue lightly, as if greeting an old tree back home. "Not here to impress," he whispered once more. "Just here to understand." And then he walked back to his dorm, where the notebook waited for another page. By the third week of the term, the students of Phillips Exit Academy had already chosen their pecking order. Some were quick with wit, some quicker with calculation, and others simply leaned on the weight of their family names. Clayton Reed, the boy from Amarillo, belonged to none of these. He still walked alone to class, still carried only his cloth-bound notebook, still answered no question unless the silence inside him left him no choice. Yet there were whispers now. They spoke of a farm boy who had corrected Whitmore not once, but twice. On the morning that would become legend, Whitmore entered the classroom without a word, as always. His face was unreadable, but his hands betrayed a certain deliberation. He set the chalk on the board's ledge, turned slowly, and surveyed the room. The students straightened in their seats. Even Sarah Chun, usually poised, tapped her pencil against her notebook. Whitmore finally spoke. "Today," he said, "we will attempt the impossible." He wrote on the board a system larger than any before. Variables sprawled across the slate like roots searching for water. Non-linear terms twisted like vines, boundary conditions piled on one another until the very air seemed heavy with contradiction. When he finished, he turned to face the class. "This problem," he said, "has been called unsolvable. It has resisted attack for decades. Yet mathematics is not about winning battles. It is about seeing clearly, even when the sight reveals only futility." A murmur ran through the room. Was he serious? Had he truly brought them a problem without solution? Whitmore's eyes sharpened. "Consider this a test," he said. "Not of your skill, but of your humility." The chalk clicked against the ledge. Silence followed. Pens moved, papers rustled, breaths quickened. The students bent themselves against the impossible wall. Clayton sat still. He copied the problem carefully, line by line, until the whole system stared at him from the page. Then he stopped. His pencil hovered. He felt again the weight of the Texas sun, the slow trickle of water down dry terraces, the way streams fell into one another until they reached the fields below. The image came unbidden. A cascade. He drew a line. Then another. He separated the variables into layers, each feeding the next like water dropping from stone to stone. The structure revealed itself. At the bottom, the contradictions swirled like silt. At the top, the fault shone clear. The boundary itself was flawed, and all that followed was doomed. It was not a solution. It was a method, a way of listening to the problem until it confessed where the lie had begun. Clayton raised his hand. The room stilled. "Sir," he said softly, "this system cannot be solved, but it can be understood. Think of it as a cascade. Each equation flows into the next. If the flow is stable, the system holds. But if one tier is false, the contradiction spreads downward until the whole structure collapses." He stood, walked to the board. With slow strokes, he drew boxes, arrows connecting them. Each arrow carried the weight of one equation into the next. He showed where the flow faltered, where the water pooled, where the boundary cracked under its own weight. "This is the cascade method," he said, voice calm, almost shy. "It does not give a solution where none exists, but it shows exactly where the false note lies." The classroom was silent. Even the faint scratching of pencils had ceased. Sarah leaned forward, her eyes wide, as if she had never seen mathematics breathe before. Wesley, once so quick to mock, stared at Clayton with his mouth half open, caught between disbelief and something like respect. Whitmore did not move. His face was unreadable stone. For a long time he let the silence hold. Then, with a voice as quiet as the dust on an old book, he said, "Remarkable." The word hung in the air like a rare bird, fragile and unforgettable. Clayton lowered the chalk, set it carefully back on the ledge, and returned to his seat. He did not smile. He opened his notebook and wrote one line. "Numbers are rivers. Follow them long enough, and they reveal their source." Whitmore finally turned to the class. "You will all attempt to prove or disprove this cascade method. It will be your work until I say otherwise." A ripple passed through the room. Not laughter, not complaint, only the uneasy thrill of being asked to walk on unfamiliar ground. That evening, the whispers began in earnest. Students gathered in corners of the library, sketching diagrams of falling water, layering equations into stair-step forms. Some mocked the idea at first, but as hours passed, the mocking voices grew quiet, for every attempt only confirmed the strength of what the farm boy had shown. Sarah sought Clayton out by the oak tree near the courtyard. She stood there awkwardly for a moment, then finally asked, "How did you see it?" Clayton looked at her, then at the notebook in his lap. "The land taught me," he said. "Rain falls in steps. If one step breaks, everything below it changes." She nodded slowly. Her eyes softened. It's beautiful, she whispered. Clayton looked down again. It's just the truth, he said. The next day, Whitmore summoned him after class. The professor's voice was sharper now, laced with something between anger and awe. That problem, he said, was part of my dissertation in 1982. No student has ever pierced it. Not one. Do you understand what you have done? Clayton shook his head. I only listened. Whitmore stared at him, the weight of decades pressing against his pride. At last he exhaled. Perhaps, he said, that is the most dangerous gift of all. That night, Clayton wrote again in his notebook. The land does not hurry. The river does not boast. They only reveal, in time, what was hidden all along. And as the lamps of the academy burned late, the whisper of a farm boy's method spread quietly through its halls, like water finding every crack in stone. Clayton Reed never thought of himself as a writer. His notebook was not polished, it was scarred. Pages smudged with dirt, corners bent, margins filled with words like try again and not yet. But in the weeks after the cascade method had entered the academy's vocabulary, Professor Whitmore began to insist that the boys' work must leave those stitched cloth covers and travel further. One evening, Whitmore called him to the office. The professor's rooms were lined with shelves of journals and dissertations, the air thick with the dry perfume of paper. On the desk sat a single lamp, casting a narrow cone of light across scattered drafts. Whitmore leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the boy. Read, he said, your method, cascade. It cannot remain in a notebook. It must be tested in the fire of peer review. If it holds, it will stand. If not, it will burn. Either way, it must be sent. Clayton shifted in his chair. Sir, I don't think anyone wants to read the scribbles of a farm boy. Whitmore's voice hardened. Mathematics does not care who holds the chalk. It cares only for truth. We will prepare a submission. A short paper, 3 pages. Clear, spare, precise. Clayton looked down at his hands, calloused still from years of farm work. He thought of his mother, mending clothes in silence, each stitch an act of stubborn hope. He nodded once. Yes, sir. And so the nights that followed became a kind of ritual. Whitmore dictated structure. Clayton filled it with the quiet patience of his reasoning. At first, the boy's language was hesitant, too much like a diary. But Whitmore guided him. Define the terms, state the contradiction, show the cascade. Slowly, the work took shape. When at last the draft was finished, Whitmore read it aloud. His voice carried no emotion, but his eyes lingered on certain lines. A system that collapses may still be traced to its false boundary. The cascade is not a solution, but a revelation. Whitmore set the paper down. For a moment he said nothing. Then he whispered, almost to himself, Journal of Emerging Mathematical Theories. We will send it there. Clayton exhaled, as if a weight he had not known he carried had been lifted, only to be replaced by another, heavier one. 2 days later, as the submission packet was prepared, Whitmore stumbled across a record he had not expected. He had asked for Clayton's academic file to supplement the cover letter, but what he found was not a transcript. It was a thin folder, half empty, its pages clipped together by hand. Inside was a note from the Amarillo shelter. Clayton Reed, age 14. Resident, winter through spring. No permanent address. Mother employed as hospital custodian. Father deceased. Whitmore read the words twice, 3 times, as if repetition might change their meaning. He had known the boy was poor, his clothes made that clear, but he had not imagined nights in a shelter. The thin blankets, the cots lined wall to wall, the hunger disguised as silence. He set the file down slowly. His throat felt tight. For decades, he had spoken of mathematics as a citadel, accessible only to those strong enough to climb its walls. And here was proof that the strongest climber he had ever seen had come not from the marble halls, but from dust and hunger. That evening, when Clayton arrived with his notebook, Whitmore studied him differently. He saw not just the quick mind, but the narrow shoulders beneath a borrowed blazer, the way his hands clutched the notebook like a lifeline. He cleared his throat. "Reed," he said, "tell me something. Where do you work when you are not here?" Clayton blinked. I don't work here, sir. I study." "No," Whitmore pressed. "Before, in Amarillo." Clayton hesitated. "I swept floors at the gas station, helped at the feed store. When the shelter had too many mouths, I shined shoes downtown. Ma, she worked nights, so I had to keep the lights on." He looked down at the floor. "But I don't think that matters to mathematics." Whitmore felt the sting of the words, though they were spoken without accusation. He leaned back in his chair, silent. For once he could find no theorem, no proof, no structure to shield himself. When the paper was finally mailed, sealed in a stiff white envelope, Clayton lingered by the mailbox. He touched the paper as if it were a part of him. For so many years, his work had existed only in the privacy of pencil and cloth, whispers between himself and the silent earth. Now it was leaving him, carried toward strangers whose faces he would never see. He whispered under his breath, "Not to win, just to be heard." Back in his dorm, he opened the notebook to a clean page and wrote, "Numbers do not belong to the rich. They belong to anyone who will wait long enough to listen." Weeks passed. The academy moved in its usual rhythm, but in the mathematics wing, a quiet hum began. The cascade method had seeded itself. Students argued in the library, some trying to disprove it, others attempting to adapt it. Sarah Chun worked late into the night, sketching cascades across entire blackboards. Wesley, once a scoffer, found himself defending the idea against doubters. The Farmboy had become a presence, even without raising his voice. Clayton remained himself. He still sat alone beneath the maple tree, still walked in cracked boots, still spoke little. But when Sarah passed him one afternoon and said softly, "Your method, it changes everything," he only shrugged and answered, "It just shows the truth sooner." One evening, Whitmore invited him again to the office. On the desk lay the boy's notebook, open to a page filled with half-erased calculations. "I read this," Whitmore said, pointing to a margin note in shaky handwriting. "Try again tomorrow. The numbers are not ready today." He looked up. "You speak of numbers as though they were alive." Clayton nodded. "In Amarillo, the land was alive. If you pushed too hard, it gave nothing. If you waited, it gave you just enough. Numbers feel the same to me." Whitmore closed the notebook with care. "Then perhaps I have been deaf all these years," he murmured. Clayton did not answer. He only looked at the professor with the same steady eyes that had once measured raindrops in a can. That night, Whitmore wrote his own line in a journal he had not opened in years. "Truth may arrive in cracked boots, and when it does, the wise must kneel to hear it." And so the paper left the academy, traveling beyond marble walls and statues, carrying with it the voice of a boy who had learned patience from the silence of dust and rain. The leaves had begun to fall in earnest, spinning like faded coins through the courtyards of Phillips Exit Academy. Each week, the talk of the cascade method grew louder, yet Clayton Reed carried himself unchanged. He still walked with his head slightly bowed, still wrote with the same pencil worn nearly to the stub, still answered questions only when silence itself demanded an answer. But something in the air had shifted. Students who once laughed now looked twice before they spoke. Even those who dismissed his method did so with caution, as though the farm boy's eyes might see what theirs could not. It was in this atmosphere that Professor Whitmore made a decision that would test not the boy, but himself. On a Tuesday morning in the great lecture hall with its tall windows and echoing stone walls, Whitmore stood at the board before a room full of restless students. His chalk hovered above the slate. For a moment he seemed almost hesitant, an unfamiliar weight on his shoulders. Then, with a sudden firmness, he turned to face the class. "I owe you all a confession," he said. The room stilled. Students glanced at one another, uncertain. Whitmore was not a man known for humility. His reputation was precision without apology. He took a breath. "The problem I set before you 3 weeks ago, the one our Mr. Reed revealed as a cascade of contradictions, was not simply unsolvable. It was, in truth, a trap. I wrote it to expose error. I wanted to show how easily arrogance can blind a mind. And I admit this. I did not believe a boy from Amarillo would see through it." The words struck the room like a sudden bell. Some students sat straighter. Others blinked in disbelief. Whitmore continued, his voice quieter now. "I created it to humiliate him. And yet, he turned it into something greater. He taught me what I had forgotten, that numbers do not serve pride. They serve truth." He set the chalk down. His hand trembled slightly as it touched the ledge. "Mr. Reed, if you would speak." Clayton felt the weight of every eye turned toward him. He rose slowly, the notebook still closed on his desk. For a moment he searched for words. Then he spoke, his voice steady but soft, carrying the accent of dry plains and long silences. "Where I come from," he said. "The land doesn't care who you are. It doesn't care if your boots are new or cracked. It doesn't care if your name is known. The land listens only to patience. If you wait, it tells you the truth. If you rush, it gives you nothing. Numbers are the same." He paused, looking down at his hands. "I never wanted to prove a professor wrong. I only wanted to hear the numbers long enough that they would finally speak. That is all." A hush filled the hall. For a moment the old wooden rafters seemed to creak in approval. Then, from the front row, Wesley, the boy who had once whispered "Farmboy" with mockery, stood. His voice was quiet, almost awkward. "He's right," Wesley said. "We laughed at him because we thought silence meant ignorance. But it was listening. And I think we should learn from it." The words loosened something in the air. Heads nodded. Sarah Chun's eyes glistened, though she said nothing. Whitmore straightened, his face lined with something close to sorrow. "Humility is not a subject we teach here," he said. "But perhaps it is the subject we need most. Mr. Reed, you have reminded me that mathematics, like the earth, punishes pride. For that, I thank you." The bell rang, but no one moved. Students filed out slowly, their voices hushed, as though they had witnessed something too fragile to disturb. Clayton remained at his desk, closing his notebook carefully. He did not look triumphant, only thoughtful. As the room emptied, Sarah lingered. She turned toward him, hesitant. "What you said about listening. I've been working on the cascade proof, but I think maybe I've been rushing. Maybe I haven't listened enough." Clayton gave the faintest of smiles. "Sometimes silence is the hardest part, but it's where the numbers live." She nodded and left him to his solitude. That night, Whitmore sat alone in his office long after the lamps had burned low. He stared at his own dissertation from 1982, the one in which he had built the very trap that Clayton had dismantled. For years he had used it as a weapon, to expose weakness, to maintain his authority. Now, in the quiet, he saw it differently. He saw arrogance etched in every line of chalk, pride hidden behind the pretense of rigor. He opened a blank page in his journal and wrote, "I tested a boy with my pride. He answered with truth. I sought to shame him. He answered with patience. Perhaps the teacher has forgotten what it means to learn." The next morning, Clayton sat once again beneath the maple tree in the courtyard, the autumn leaves gathering at his feet. His notebook lay open on his lap. He had written a single line across the page. Numbers do not punish. They wait. Pride punishes itself. For a long while he sat there, listening to the wind move through the branches, the faint sound of students hurrying to class. He closed the notebook and whispered to the silence, as though to the fields of Amarillo themselves, "I will keep listening." And the silence, as always, seemed to answer. The confession of Professor Whitmore did not vanish into silence. It spread. It lingered in the halls of Phillips Exit Academy like the echo of a bell rung at dawn, quiet, but impossible to ignore. Students carried it from desk to desk, whispered it over late-night coffee in the Commons, repeated it as though testing the taste of humility on their tongues. And at the center of it all was a boy who asked for nothing but silence. Clayton Reed continued as he always had. He sat at the back of the lecture hall, his notebook open, his pencil steady. He walked with the same slow gait, boots cracked at the heel. But where once he had been invisible, now his presence drew attention even when he said nothing. For his silence had been revealed as not emptiness, but listening. Whitmore, too, was changed. He no longer spoke as though lecturing a battlefield. His voice, though still sharp, carried a new cadence, an undercurrent of caution, even of respect. The cascade method had humbled him, and in humbling him, it humbled the class as well. It was Whitmore who first spoke the word aloud. "Tomorrow," he said one morning, chalk tapping the board, "Mr. Reed will give us a lecture of his own." A mini-lecture on the cascade. The room stiffened. Some students leaned forward, eager. Others frowned in disbelief. A farm boy lecturing in Whitmore's class? But the professor's face left no space for protest. "Mathematics is not inherited," he said simply. "It is revealed, and Reed has revealed." Clayton felt the air thicken around him, but he only lowered his eyes to the page and nodded. The next day, the room was full before the bell rang. Sarah sat near the front, her notebook open. Wesley leaned back in his chair, arms crossed but eyes intent. Even students from other courses slipped into the back rows, curious to witness what the whispers had promised. Clayton walked to the board with the same hesitant steps he had always taken, notebook in hand. He set it down, picked up the chalk. For a moment, he simply stood, silent, looking at the black slate as though waiting for it to speak. Then he drew. Not equations at first, but shapes, boxes, arrows, flows. He spoke as he drew, his voice low, even. "Think of a system," he said, "as a series of levels. Each level feeds the next, like water falling from stone to stone. If every level is sound, the water runs clear. If one is cracked, everything below is muddied." The arrows became equations. Variables flowed into one another. Boundaries revealed themselves like riverbanks. "This is the cascade," he said. "It does not always solve, but it always listens. And by listening, it shows where the false note lies." He stepped back. The board was covered not in tangled symbols but in a clear map, mathematics that looked almost like music. Sarah raised her hand. "But what if every boundary is sound? Does the cascade still help?" Clayton nodded. "Then it carries the water cleanly. It shows not only where failure lies, but also where truth flows without resistance. It tells you not only when you are wrong, but when you are right." Wesley leaned forward now. "And if you misjudge a level? Then the cascade teaches you to go back, Clayton said. "Numbers don't punish. They just wait until you look again." The room was silent. Even Whitmore remained still, hands folded, watching. When Clayton set the chalk down and closed his notebook, the students did not clap. The moment was too raw for applause. Instead, they sat quietly, as if each one had been given something fragile to hold. In the days that followed, Whitmore announced a new assignment. Each student must either prove or disprove the cascade method, using examples of their choice. "Attack it if you can," he told them. "Strengthen it if you cannot. But do not ignore it. Silence is no longer an option." The academy came alive. In the library, diagrams of cascades covered the walls. In the dining hall, equations were scrawled on napkins. Arguments broke out in courtyards, not of insult but of logic. Some swore the cascade was a trick, an illusion of clarity. Others swore it was a revolution, but none could deny that it had forced them to think differently. Even the faculty began to take notice. Professors from other departments drifted into Whitmore's class, listening quietly from the back. A lecturer in applied mechanics asked if she might borrow Clayton's notes. A visiting scholar from Johns Hopkins requested to see his notebook, promising it would be treated with care. Clayton allowed it, though he always asked for it back before nightfall, as if it were a part of his own body. Sarah worked tirelessly, her own proofs spilling across pages in neat lines of ink. One evening, she found Clayton beneath the maple tree, his notebook balanced on his knee. "I tried to break it," she admitted. "I tried every variation I could, but the cascade still holds." Clayton looked up at her. "That's because the land holds," he said. "The water always finds its way down. All we do is follow." She sat beside him, quiet. For the first time, she felt the silence he carried, not as distance, but as shelter. Wesley, too, was changed. He had once mocked the boy, but now he approached him after class, notebook in hand. "I can't make sense of this boundary," he said gruffly. "Show me what I'm missing." Clayton took the notebook, studied it. "You're not missing anything," he said. "You're just moving too fast. Wait for the numbers to tell you. They will." Wesley frowned, then nodded. For the first time, he called him not Farmboy, but simply Clay. The ripple spread beyond students. Whitmore himself began to speak differently in faculty meetings. He no longer presented himself as the gatekeeper of truth. Instead, he spoke of humility, of listening, of the need to let problems reveal themselves. Some colleagues scoffed. Others listened more carefully than they would admit. And in the quiet of his office, Whitmore returned again and again to Clayton's notebook. He turned its pages slowly, reading the penciled notes, the self-corrections, the dirt smudges. He realized with a pang that he was learning again, not from a peer, not from a book, but from a boy who had once lived in a shelter in Amarillo. One evening, as the chapel bells rang across the campus, Clayton walked alone toward his dormitory. The air was crisp, the leaves crunching beneath his boots. He thought of the whispers, the stares, the requests for his notes. They did not matter to him. What mattered was that the numbers were being heard, not for glory, not for pride, but for truth. He opened his notebook before bed and wrote, "A ripple begins in silence. Only later does the water carry it outward. I will stay at the source." And with that, he closed the book, blew out the lamp, and let the quiet of the night settle around him, like the fields of home. The first frost of November brushed the lawns of Phillips Exit Academy when the letter arrived. It was thin, formal, stamped with the seal of the National Olympiad Committee. Professor Whitmore read it once, twice, then placed it carefully on his desk before summoning Clayton Reed. When the boy entered, notebook in hand as always, Whitmore tapped the envelope. "You've been invited," he said. "Regional training camp. From there, the Olympiad." Clayton looked at the paper but did not reach for it. "I didn't ask for that," he murmured. "No," Whitmore answered, "but mathematics has asked for you." The camp was held in the hills of Virginia, where the trees stood bare against a sky of steel. Dozens of the sharpest young minds in the region gathered in an old stone lodge, its halls echoing with arguments about primes and probabilities. To them, competition was fuel. To Clayton, it was a language he did not yet understand. He carried the same notebook, wore the same cracked boots. The others arrived with laptops, fresh pens, calculators gleaming. Some eyed him curiously. Others dismissed him at once. Yet when the first round of problems was posted, an array of tangled inequalities and unsolved conjectures, the quiet boy from Amarillo bent his head and began. Within hours, whispers spread. His solutions were not only correct, but strange. 3 different approaches to a single problem, as though he wanted to listen to it from every side before declaring the truth. Where others sought speed, he sought depth. Where others rushed, he lingered. And in lingering, he found what they missed. Among the students was Timothy Whitmore, the professor's son. He was tall, confident, sharp with words. For years he had lived under the shadow of his father's reputation, and he carried that weight like armor. At first he regarded Clayton with cool disdain. "My father talks about you," he said one evening, voice edged with challenge. "But you're just a farm boy with a trick." Clayton met his gaze without anger. "It isn't a trick. It's listening." Timothy scoffed. But later that night, when the problems proved too tangled, he found himself glancing at Clayton's notebook, watching the slow, deliberate hand trace the cascade. Something in him shifted, resentment bending slowly into respect. The camp's decisive test came on the 3rd day. The students were divided into teams and given a single monstrous problem, a variant of a theorem Whitmore himself had once struggled with. The problem required not speed, but collaboration. Clayton's team was formed almost by accident. Sarah Chun, precise and unyielding. Timothy Whitmore, proud but brilliant. Levi, a boy from an Amish community who had studied number theory by lantern light. Together they sat at a long oak table, the paper before them like a mountain too high to see its summit. For a time they worked in fragments. Sarah proved small lemmas. Timothy attacked the core with fire. Levi offered quiet insights. But the pieces did not fit. The mountain loomed, unyielding. Then Clayton spoke, his voice steady. "We're fighting the problem. We need to listen instead." They paused. He opened his notebook and drew the familiar cascade. "Let's divide the problem into flows. Sarah, you hold the top, keep the boundaries. Levi, trace the middle. Timothy, test the base. I'll follow the contradictions downward. If the structure holds, it will tell us where the fault lies." They worked as he said. Slowly, the chaos began to settle. Sarah's boundaries held firm. Levi's middle paths connected. Timothy, though reluctant at first, began to see how the cascade illuminated weaknesses, and when Clayton followed the contradiction downward, he found the point of fracture. Together they repaired it, stone by stone. By dusk, the solution lay complete. The judges examined it with raised brows. For the first time in camp history, a team had not only solved the problem, but mapped 3 separate pathways through it. The result was clear. Clayton's team had won. That night, while the others celebrated, Clayton stood by a window, staring out at the bare branches against the moonlit sky. Timothy approached, hands in his pockets. He hesitated, then said, "I wanted to beat you, but instead, I learned from you. Maybe that's better." Clayton turned. Numbers don't belong to anyone, he said softly. We only borrow them long enough to listen. Timothy nodded, a new respect in his eyes. For the first time, he offered his hand. Clayton shook it, his grip firm, but gentle. Yet even in victory, a storm was gathering. Late that evening, as the lodge quieted, a call came for Clayton. It was from Amarillo. His mother, Eleanor, had collapsed at work. The words fell heavy. Late-stage cancer. Discovered too late. Moving fast. She was in the hospital, asking for him. Clayton stood in the hallway, the receiver pressed to his ear, the world narrowing to the sound of his own breath. He closed his eyes. For a moment, the triumph of the day seemed cruel, meaningless. Numbers could reveal contradictions in equations, but they could not solve the boundary conditions of a failing body. He returned to his room in silence. The others looked at him, waiting for news, but he said nothing. He opened his notebook, turned to a blank page, and wrote, "Don't ask if the problem can be solved. Ask who is waiting for its answer." The next morning, the camp resumed, but Clayton's heart was elsewhere. His teammates noticed the shadows under his eyes, the way his pencil lingered longer on the page. Sarah asked quietly, "Are you all right?" He nodded once, but said nothing more. When the final session ended, he packed his few things, boots, blazer, notebook, and prepared for the long journey back to Texas. The team had earned its place at the Olympiad, but for Clayton, the real test lay not in Washington, not in any problem on paper, but in a hospital room under the dim lights of Amarillo. As he boarded the bus, the first snow of the season began to fall. The flakes melted on the cracked leather of his boots. He held his notebook close as though it carried warmth. Outside the window, the storm gathered, white and endless. Clayton closed his eyes and whispered to himself, "Not here to impress. Just here to understand." The road stretched before him, dark and uncertain, but he did not turn back. The winter sun over Washington shone pale and brittle, casting long shadows across the marble steps of the National Olympiad Hall. Inside, rows of desks stood ready, each with a name card, a sharpened pencil, and the silent weight of expectation. Students from every corner of the country had gathered, children of professors, heirs of engineers, prodigies polished by tutors, and among them sat a boy from Amarillo, his boots still cracked at the heel, his blazer still a shade too large, his cloth-bound notebook resting quietly at his side. Clayton Reed did not look around at the gilded ceilings or the flags that hung from the rafters. He kept his eyes on the blank page before him, listening to the silence the way he once listened for rain in a tin can. For him, this was not a contest. It was another conversation with numbers, another chance to listen long enough until they finally spoke. The bell rang. The problems were placed face down. Then came the command, "Begin." Pages turned, pencils moved. Clayton unfolded his sheet slowly, as if afraid the paper itself might shatter. Problems 1 through 5 spread across the first pages, challenging, intricate, but familiar ground. Number theory, combinatorics, geometry woven like tight nets. He worked through them methodically, pencil steady, never rushing. To him, they were not hurdles but rivers to be crossed, each carrying him closer to the place where silence waited. Then he turned the final page. Problem 6. The words stared back at him. Every even number in the sequence P, defined as the sum of two distinct primes minus 2, can be expressed as the sum of two primes. Prove or disprove. A ripple passed through the hall. He could feel it in the air, the intake of breath, the sudden stiffness of shoulders. This was no ordinary problem. It was a shadow cast by the great unsolved conjectures of mathematics, a child of Goldbach clothed in new conditions. No one had solved it before. Some whispered it was impossible. Others called it a trick. Clayton bent his head. He read it again. and again. Then he closed his eyes. In his mind, he saw not numbers but the dry fields of Texas. He saw rain cascading from terrace to terrace, water breaking into rivulets, some paths joining, others fading. He imagined the even numbers as terraces, each waiting to be filled. He imagined primes as the streams feeding them. And in that vision, he began to trace the flow. His pencil moved. He tested small cases first, 4, 6, 8, 10. They held. But as the numbers grew, patterns bent. At certain values, the cascade faltered, as though a terrace had cracked. He traced the contradiction downward, just as he had done weeks before. And there it was. Conditions under which the sum failed. A hidden fault. Clayton drew carefully. He did not rush. He mapped the numbers as though they were land he had walked since childhood. At last, he wrote a sentence in his quiet, heavy hand. If P mod 4 equals 2, the condition collapses. Therefore, the claim cannot hold for all P. The cascade reveals an infinite set of failures. He set his pencil down. The hall was still filled with frantic scribbling, students wrestling, sweating, cursing under their breath. But to Clayton, the silence had spoken. He folded his paper, laid his pencil neatly across it, and closed his eyes. When the bell rang hours later, the judges moved through the hall collecting papers. Clayton rose, notebook in hand. He felt neither triumph nor relief, only the steady calm of one who had listened until the numbers told the truth. That evening the results were posted. 5 problems, then 6. Names filled the board with partial scores, 34, 38, 40. And at the bottom, one name stood alone, Clayton Reed, 42, 42. Perfect. A hush fell over the crowd. It was the first perfect score in the history of the National Olympiad. Even the judges, seasoned and stern, whispered among themselves. Reporters scribbled notes. Photographers lifted their cameras. Clayton stood at the edge of the room, notebook pressed against his chest. Sarah found him first. Her eyes shone. "Clayton, you did it." He shook his head gently. "I didn't do anything. The numbers did. I only listened." Wesley clapped him on the shoulder. "Farmboy," he said, but the words no longer mocked. They carried respect. Timothy Whitmore approached last. His father's shadow had long weighed on him, but now he looked at Clayton with unguarded admiration. "You've written your name into history," he said. Clayton's gaze was steady. "History isn't the point. Truth is." The next morning, the finalists were asked to present their solutions to the panel. Clayton stepped forward, notebook in hand. His voice was calm, without flourish. He spoke of terraces and cascades, of conditions that held and those that cracked. He drew arrows, boxes, flows. He showed the counterexample, then the infinite family that followed. When he finished, the room was silent. One judge, an old mathematician with white hair, leaned forward. "Young man," he said, "do you realize what you have done? You have not only solved our problem, you have illuminated a path through a thicket we thought impassable." Clayton looked down at his notebook. "I only followed the river," he said softly. That night, in the quiet of his hotel room, Clayton opened his notebook to a clean page. He wrote, "Not for victory, not for glory, only to listen, until the silence itself speaks." Outside, the city lights glittered. The world was already beginning to speak his name. But Clayton Reed, boy from Amarillo, closed the book, lay back on the narrow bed, and let the hum of the city fade into the same stillness he had always known. In that silence, he heard the voice of his mother, faint but steady. as though carried across miles of wind. Numbers are patient, Clay. Be patient with them, and they will answer. And with that memory in his heart, he drifted into sleep, not as a champion, not as a prodigy, but simply as a listener. The train carried him south, away from the marble halls of Washington and back toward the wide plains of Texas. Outside the window, snow gave way to dust, and the sky grew larger, emptier, like an old friend waiting at the horizon. In his hands he held the medal from the Olympiad, but it felt strangely heavy, like something that did not belong to him. Tucked beneath it was the only thing that did, the cloth-bound notebook, worn thin, filled with equations and quiet words that had guided him through every storm. When he reached Amarillo, the air was dry, the streets familiar. At the hospital, he found his mother lying small against the white sheets, her hands pale, her breath shallow. Yet when she saw him, her eyes lit with a warmth no sickness could extinguish. "Clay," she whispered, voice fragile but steady. "You listened. I knew you would." He knelt beside her, pressing his forehead to her hand. "I tried, Ma. I listened to every number until they told me the truth." She smiled faintly. "That's all anyone can do. Numbers, people, even the earth, they all speak if you wait long enough." For 2 weeks, Clayton remained at her side. He read from his notebook, not proofs or theorems, but the lines he had written late at night. Numbers are rivers. Pride punishes itself. Silence is where truth waits. She listened, her eyes closing, as if the words were lullabies. And on the first evening of spring, with the last light of day stretching across the window, Eleanor Reed took one final breath and was gone. Clayton sat in silence. He did not weep at first. He only held her hand, still warm, and whispered, "Thank you for stitching the notebook. Thank you for stitching me." The Academy sent letters. MIT sent an invitation. Journalists sent questions. But Clayton stayed in Amarillo. He walked the fields his father once worked, ran his hand through the cracked soil, and remembered every lesson the land had given him. It was there, beneath the wide sky, that he made his decision. He would not go east, not yet. He would stay, and he would plant. By summer, the townspeople began to notice children gathering in the reed yard. Boys with dusty shoes, girls carrying worn pencils, all of them sitting on wooden crates beneath the open sky. Clayton stood before them with nothing but a piece of chalk and a blackboard salvaged from the junkyard. He began simply. "Math," he told them, "is not about winning. It's about listening." He drew a line, then a curve. A slope is just the way a roof leans in the wind. A parabola is the way water arcs from a pump. A derivative is how fast the creek deepens after rain. The children leaned forward, eyes wide. For the first time, numbers felt alive to them. Not like cages of rules, but like voices whispering truths of the world they already knew. Word spread. More children came. Some from farms miles away, some from the edges of town. They brought whatever paper they could find, pencils worn to stubs. They filled the yard until there was no room left to sit. Clayton built benches from scrap wood. He called it simply the field school. Math, logic, listening. When Whitmore heard of it, he wrote a letter, his words formal but trembling. "Clayton, you have done what I could not. You have turned mathematics into an inheritance for those who had none. This, more than any medal, will be your legacy." By August, MIT wrote again, urging him to join in the fall. He replied with a single request: defer 1 year. He explained that seeds had been planted, and seeds could not be left alone. To his surprise, they agreed. The world was beginning to understand that this boy did not move at its pace, but at the Earth's. One evening, as the sun set red over the plains, Clayton gathered his students. He held in his hands a small clay jar filled with soil from the family field. "This," he said, "is what raised me. Dust and numbers. Both patient, both silent, until you listen." He pressed the jar to his chest. "When I leave for MIT, I will take this with me. Not to remember where I came from, because I will never forget, but to remind me that genius is not speed or pride or fame. Genius is only the courage to keep listening." The children nodded, some too young to understand, others old enough to feel the truth settle deep. That night, alone in his room, Clayton opened his notebook for the final time that summer. The pages were nearly full. He turned to the last blank space and wrote in his steady hand, "A genius is not the one who knows the most, but the one who dares to keep listening when the world demands noise." He closed the book, placed it beside the jar of soil, and looked out the window. The fields stretched into the horizon, quiet and endless. Somewhere, far to the east, the towers of MIT waited. But for now, the land was his classroom, silence his chalkboard, patience his only test. And in that stillness, beneath the stars of Amarillo, the boy who had once measured rain in a tin can became something larger than champion or prodigy. He became a voice of listening, carrying forward the inheritance of dust and numbers, a legacy stitched not in marble, but in earth. Thank you for listening to the story of Clayton Reed, the farm boy who carried both a hunger for knowledge and a humble heart. If his journey has touched your memories, warmed some quiet corner of your loneliness, or rekindled your faith that wisdom and kindness always find their way, then please stay with us. By pressing the subscribe button, you're not only joining us for future stories, but also helping to keep alive a flame. The flame of listening, of compassion, and of the legacy we pass on to the generations to come.